Thank you so much to our panelists. Our next segment will dive into job creation, the economy, inflation, and recession. This is a conversation with the Honorable Wilbur Ross, former U.S. Secretary of Commerce and current chairman of the board of the Ross Acquisition Corp. And leading the conversation today is James Fontanella-Kahn, reporter with the Financial Times.
Hi, everyone. Secretary, it's a pleasure to have you with us. I'd like to start with a broad questions, like what are the challenges and opportunities that you see for the U.S. economy going ahead?
Well, I think both are huge and in some ways without parallel. The AI is going to be transformative to most economies, but especially to the more advanced and more highly industrialized ones. Because to me, the real benefit from AI will come to the people who use it as opposed to the people who just provide it. So I think that's one big set of opportunities. It also brings some challenge because it clearly will change the nature of work, just as computers did in the old days, just as textile machinery did in England in the 19th century. So it'll require some retraining. And that's one of the areas I worry some about. During our administration, Ivanka Trump and I co-chaired the workforce development initiatives. And we learned a lot of things that were troublesome. One, the U.S. has the least vocational training of any OECD country.
Wow.
The least. Second, at a more high skill level, they pretty much don't teach math, high school math, they don't teach physics, they don't teach chemistry in high schools anymore. They say the students find them too difficult. Well, that was always true. In my day, we found it too difficult, and the answer was you worked a little harder. Now, instead, they're editing it out of the curriculum. So whether our educational system will meet the challenges which create the opportunity, that to me is the biggest single question.
Absolutely. So you mentioned AI as the perfect example of a threat and an opportunity. I guess the question is how does this also affect the labor market? We're in a situation where actually, despite inflation being very high, the labor market is still pretty strong.
Right.
But there's threats about, how jobs will be impacted. So I guess the first question is, what can be done maybe to increase the labor supply? Let's start with that.
Well, the biggest problem with the labor statistics is the labor participation rate. It's been pretty well stuck at about 62%
Correct.
For quite some time. That means that 38% of people who are in the right age bracket for workforce neither have a job nor want one.
Mm.
That's a very high percentage, and that's a huge number of people. In some cases, it's a mismatch of skill set. In another case, there's substance abuse. There are a variety of reasons for it. But we need to get that participation rate up.
How do we do that?
Well, I think training is an important thing. A guy who's been used to being a dishwasher is not very much helped by the need for a computer programmer or for a code writer. So training is the thing. And what we did a lot on in the Trump administration was working with community colleges. The community colleges, by and large, don't have the teacher union restrictions that the secondary and primary schools have. So they were very open to doing joint programs with manufacturers, where the manufacturer would commit a certain amount of resources to the school and would commit that if a student passed enough testing, they would get a guaranteed job at an average of around 60,000, so fairly decent jobs. So those are some initiatives, but at the end of the day, it's really the federal government that's responsible for education, the funding and all that. They have to be willing to fix it, and they don't seem to be at this stage.
Fair enough. Sticking on the theme of inflation, the Fed has been increasing rates very steadily. Part of that is trying to kind of suppress kind of wage increases. Is that strategy working, or do you think something better could be done?
Well, I think the big test case there will be the current labor negotiations between the UAW and the big three car companies. Those are huge employers, and because that union is so prominent, it will have a big impact on all subsequent negotiations. Now, the union demands are quite extreme. They want a $16,000 per worker signing bonus, signing back up for their same old job. They want to think a 40% total increase over the life of the contract. And then worst of all, they, like many other unions, are now trying to insist on cost of living increase, COLA things. Anytime you start putting COLAs onto things, you are going to generate inflation because it's self-propelling and self-fulfilling. So I think that set of contracts is going to be a big bellwether as to whether the wage part of inflation is under control. The other two big parts, energy is a big part of it. And we've been in a little bit of an illogical situation in that our government seems surprised that if you make a product more scarce, it becomes more expensive. But that's kind of a truism. And so I think between our government's activities, however well considered they may be from a climate control point of view, I think to the degree that they're restricting hydrocarbons, it's going to have an inflationary problem. And to the degree that their relationships with the Gulf countries don't get better, they're going to be having upward pressure on price from Saudi and other parties. So that part, I think, is a little dangerous. Third big component is housing. And shelter is a large component of the CPI. The way we measure it is a pretty bizarre way, very judgmental way. Rather than taking the actual cost of occupancy of a resident, what they do is they make a survey of homeowners and they say, well, what do you think you would have to pay to live in this kind of residence if you didn't own it? Well, I don't think the average person has a clue what would be the cost
right price
of doing it. So it's a very subjective measure, and it has tended to lag reality. I mean, reality is there's a lot of upward pressure on true shelter costs. So I think those are problematic factors in inflation. And then the last one is budget deficits. We're running 5-6% budget deficit as a percent of GDP. Hard to imagine if you're having that kind of deficit, hard to imagine that there won't be inflationary pressures. So I think the Fed also, in my view, should be considering divestiture of some of its long-term bonds. They got up to $8 trillion or so, too big a number, and all they're doing is letting the runoff not be reinvested. They're not actually selling bonds. But I think if they were, there would be a change in the yield curve. And right now, you have this inverse curve where the short rates are higher than the long rates. That's not a normal thing. It's not stable. And I think it's largely due to the Fed policy of just pushing up the price of money rather than the availability.
Fair enough. Another issue kind of that you mentioned is like Saudi Arabia and kind of, do you think a deal can be reached there or some kind of like negotiation given your
Well, we
international experience?
had made very good progress in the region with the Abraham Accords and with direct dealings with the Saudis. We, in fact, when we had the big trip over there early in the administration, agreed to sell them a lot of air defense systems and a lot of F-35 fighters. President Biden's first week in office, he canceled that over the humanitarian issues, the slaying of the journalist. Well, obviously, that was a horrible thing that happened, but I don't think it justified canceling military aid to Saudi, because all that does is help Iran. And sure enough, a week after Biden canceled those orders, the Houthis, who are surrogates for Iran, started shelling Aramco. So we hurt our relationships with the Saudis by doing that.
So you see that as a way to kind of try to mend it up?
Yeah.
Fair enough. I have a follow-up on China, but before we go to that, stick on the Fed. Do you think they'll increase rates again, or?
Well, I think a lot will depend on this GM, Ford, and Solaris contract, because that's going to have a lot to do with wage inflation. I don't think the Fed, as I say, has handled it the best. I would have done more at the long end than they've been doing. I would be selling some of those bonds rather than just letting the fairly short-term runoff.
Yeah.
Because when you just don't reinvest the maturity, you're not addressing the long end, because something that matures in 6 months is obviously very short.
Sure. Fair enough. On China, it's a region that you know very well. You've worked a lot on the trade negotiations. There's a sense of like things are not necessarily getting better. How is that weighing on inflation? Do you think there's a way of like normalizing the relationship with China?
Well, our trade deficit with China is in the 300-400 billion a year range. So when you compare that to the size of the economy, even if that portion went up 5 or so percent, it's not determinative for the whole economy. Plus, there are other sources, alternate sources to China. Mexico is a big beneficiary of the current problems with China. Vietnam's a beneficiary. Those two are not as big a country by a long shot as China, but you are having the relocation away from China, both to the U.S. and to low-wage countries, of manufacturing. And I think that trend is going to continue.
But do you think it can make up for what might be a change in ties with China?
Well, we in China are battling it out for who's going to be the world's leading power. So there's always going to be some degree of love-hate in that relationship, and it'll swing one way or the other. The whole Taiwan situation, obviously very tied with that.
Absolutely. You mentioned some other countries, like the relationship with India. Is that a potential kind of new important relationship for the U.S.? It's already obviously very important, but like an expansion of it.
Sure. India is a logical counterweight to China. For one thing, they have a big land border between the two countries, and two, people don't realize, but there have been armed troops on both sides of that border for quite a while. Then there are occasional little outbursts. So India, logically, should be looking to more relations with us. Problem India has is a couple of things. One, it has a zillion political parties, and it's always a kind of coalition government. It's very hard for coalition governments to take decisive action by the very nature of it. So I think it'll be slower than it could be with India. But India is definitely going to come way up the technological scale. They're already doing some very good things in outer space. They're making a big push into semiconductors. They're trying in a lot of high-tech areas, and they may very well succeed.
Absolutely. We've seen a lot of US companies investing in
Yeah.
India as a way of kind of diversifying from China. Talking about Apple and tech, how can tech generally help on the side of kind of, again, lowering inflation, creating new opportunities for the labor market?
Well, it mainly is going to be changing the nature of work. But you can argue, how do you make a nation grow? It's a question of increased size of the labor force eligible people times the percentage of those people who are in the labor force times productivity increases. Those are the three factors. The productivity increases where I think the AI will come in. The change in labor force participation, each percentage point's a couple million people. It's a big number. So just moving that 62% to 65, 66 would help very much to close the gap between unemployed people and open jobs. So it's not a earth-shattering number that you need to do, but you need to change the psychology.
How do you do that?
Well, I think we have to do it in a number of ways. One is some of it is a skill set mismatch. I think the other thing is we have to get out of the habit of paying people more not to work than they ever earned when they were working. I think a lot of the labor dissent we have now comes from that. A guy who was making $15 or $18 an hour when he was working, suddenly with all the COVID help, was making often $25 an hour. Well, what message does this send to the person? First of all, it sends them a message, my former employer must have been exploiting me.
Sure.
Because now I'm worth 2/3 more for doing nothing than I was when I was working. Not a good labor attitude, and it makes people too feeling entitled.
Fair enough. You mentioned before kind of how you kind of was trying to kind of build links between industry and community colleges. More broadly, like how can kind of public-private partnerships kind of help boost growth?
Well, in effect, that's what they are. Most of the community colleges are state-owned or city-owned or locally owned, and the corporate sponsors who work with them are obviously private sector. So it's already evolving. But what would be a big help would be if the federal government would start pushing the high schools to change their curricula. It's ridiculous that there's no vocational training to speak of in high schools. There should be. Not everybody should go to college. Not everybody needs to go to college. But then for those who are, they really have to get back teaching high school math, high school science, high school chemistry. It's not that hard. It's just the only one I can see in a position to do it is the federal government. And so far, I don't see any signs of it.
But how can that, I mean, what are kind of examples of ways that like business and government can work together beyond kind of colleges?
Well, we had this workforce development. We got American businesses to commit to over 6 million jobs over the next 5 years to come out of these worker development programs. And that's still going on. The administration has not done away with that. They haven't particularly pushed it, but at least they're letting it flourish. But the companies don't get anything special by way of a tax break for doing that. A very modest tax break would encourage even more to do it. And so the mechanics are there, the mechanism is there. A little more incentive would help, particularly the smaller companies. If I'm Caterpillar Tractor in some big factory town, I can afford to introduce a curriculum aspect into the community college. But if I'm a guy who needs one employee, how do I do the program?
Yeah.
So helping the small businesses that have some specialized needs work with the community colleges, I think would be very useful.
Fantastic. I have a lot more questions for you, but we've run out of time. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you. Good to
Thank you.
see you.
After you, Secretary.